So in ancient Greece, the Oracle of Delphi told Socrates that he was the wisest man in Athens, which really confused Socrates because he claimed to know nothing. So what he did is he wandered around Athens trying to find the smartest people, and he soon realized that after talking to them, upon questioning, they didn't know much about what they actually claimed to know. So they had a unconscious incompetence. And Socrates realized that what made him the wisest man in Athens was that he knew that he didn't know nothing. So he had a conscious incompetence. This is a lot like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where the people who are most confident in their knowledge actually know the least because they don't know what they don't know. So when you go into any area of knowledge, when I first went to welding school, I thought, welding's not rocket science. You just melt two pieces of metal together, boom, you have a weld. But soon I realized that there's different types of welders. There's different types of flux, different chemicals that go on the electrodes. There's different amperages and wattages, and there's different types of welders. Some have transformers in them. And there's different types of gases and all these things. And you soon become overwhelmed because you realize how little you actually know about a topic. And I think any area of study is like this, where you could actually spend a lifetime diving deep into a subject like welding and still not know all there is to know. This is actually very, very painful. When you realize you were wrong about a belief or how little you actually know about something, it can be embarrassing, it can be shameful, it can create cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable feeling in your brain when you realize that you were actually wrong about something or that two of your beliefs are conflicting. So Socrates soon realized that most people don't want to find the truth and that they actually find it annoying. So they actually killed Socrates because he was corrupting the youth, right? He called himself the gadfly of Athens because he'd go around testing how hollow people's beliefs were. And eventually this annoyed people and pissed people off so much that they killed him. But seeking wisdom is a lot like going to the gym for the soul. It's uncomfortable while you're doing it, but over time, you develop a stronger soul and a more beautiful soul. And this was Socrates' primary interest, was developing a beautiful soul. So Socrates believed that we have a timeless and immortal soul, that the soul was here before our body and that the soul is going to be here after our body. And that the soul already had knowledge of all these timeless and immortal things like beauty, justice, courage. And that through asking the right questions, we could remember these things. So he illustrates this in the Meno, where he takes a slave boy who knows nothing about geometry, and then through asking him a series of questions, the boy basically teaches himself geometry. Through asking the right questions, the person comes to the right knowledge. Now, Plato illustrates this with the allegory of the cave, where he basically says, imagine that there's a bunch of people chained to a wall, and behind that wall there's a fire, and then there's some people with some puppets casting shadows on the wall. And the prisoners, they believe those shadows to be true reality. But one day, one person escapes the cave, and he goes outside and he's blinded by the light. And it's painful at first, but this is the true world. And that once you escape the cave, it's really hard to go back. Once you see the truth, once you get a taste for the truth, you can't go back to the cave. Plato saw the shadows of the cave as this material, temporary, physical world. And outside the cave, that is the things of substance, truth, the soul, justice, courage, these immaterial things, which he called the world of forms. And the philosopher's job is to study this theory of forms, study the truth, the true reality, the true nature of things, and gain some kind of wisdom or knowledge about them to develop a beautiful strong soul. Now, a lot of people will say ignorance is bliss, and this is true to some degree, but a cow is ignorant and they're happily eating grass in the field. Would you trade places with the cow just because they're more ignorant and they might be happier? Or think back on your younger self. You might have been more ignorant about things and you might have been more confident in yourself and your beliefs. But would you trade places? Would you trade up that knowledge that you've gained through time and experience? Probably not. And most people wouldn't. So this is like the exiting the cave, right? Once you exit the cave, it might be more painful at first, but you feel bad for the people in the cave. You feel bad for the people who have ignorance, who lack some sort of wisdom or clarity about life. So it's a lot like exercise. It's painful, but it's beneficial in the long run. And if you've ever lost weight, you wouldn't want to go back to being that fat person, even though it was hard to diet and exercise and learn all these things and gain knowledge about them. So every problem in life is a knowledge problem. Your income is the way it is because you don't have the wisdom on how to make more. Your life maybe isn't as good as you'd like it to be because you lack wisdom on what the good life is. So how did Socrates gain wisdom? What was his method? He used something called the Elenchus. So the basic outline of an Elenchus is that Socrates gets you to make a claim, then he gets you to agree on a new proposition, and then he shows how the new proposition conflicts with the original claim so that you have to change one of them. Great example of an Elenchus is in Plato's dialogue Lyceum, where Socrates is talking to two generals about what courage is. And this is on the dialogue Lyceum 192 C to E. Lyceum says, well then, I think it is a sort of endurance of the soul. He's talking about courage here, what courage is. If it is necessary to say what its nature is in all these cases. Socrates, but it is necessary at any rate if we are to give an answer to our question. Now this is what appears to me. I think that you don't regard every kind of endurance as courage. The reason I think so is this. I am fairly sure, Lyceum, that you regard courage as a very fine thing. Lyceum, one of the finest, you may be sure. Socrates, and you would say that endurance accompanied by wisdom is a fine and noble thing. Lyceum, very much so. Socrates, suppose it is accompanied by folly. Isn't it just the opposite, harmful and injurious? Lyceum, yes. Socrates, and you're going to call a thing fine which is of the injurious and harmful sort? Lyceum, no, that wouldn't be right, Socrates. Socrates, then you won't allow this kind of endurance to be courage, since it is not fine, whereas courage is fine. Lyceum, you are right. So let's trace the Elenchus here. Lyceum starts off with the claim, I think courage is a sort of endurance or persistence of the soul. Then Socrates goes on to say, well, do you regard courage as a very fine thing? And Lyceum says, of course, it's one of the finest things. So Socrates says, suppose you have endurance or persistence in ignorance or something that's bad for you. Would you regard that as a harmful thing? And Lyceum says, yes. So Socrates is saying, you're going to call a thing good, which is actually harmful for someone? And Lyceum says, no, that wouldn't be right, Socrates. Then Socrates says, you wouldn't allow that type of endurance or persistence to be courage then. And then Lyceum agrees. He says, of course not. So the basic structure is that you make a claim or someone makes a claim, you find a contradiction in that claim, and then you reformulate the argument, and then you redo steps 1 and 2 until you reach a state of an aporia, or basically confusion, or you hit an impasse. You can't go any further. Another great example of an Elenchus is in the movie Pulp Fiction, where the characters Vince and Jules, played by Samuel L. Jackson and Alec Baldwin, are discussing how Marcel threw someone off a balcony because he caught the guy massaging his wife's feet. Now, Jules thinks this is an overreaction because he's basically saying that a foot massage isn't associated with sexual acts, so violence isn't permitted. And then Jules asks him a series of questions where he's like, "Oh, well, would you?" Jules is saying, "Oh, I give my grandma a foot massage. I give tons of people a foot massage. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything sexual about it, so violence isn't permitted." And then Vince asks him a series of questions, and he's basically like, "Well, would you give a guy a foot massage?" And then Jules is like, "Fuck you, man." So right there, it showed a contradiction in Jules' first premise that a foot massage doesn't have any kind of sexual context, because he wouldn't give a foot massage to a guy. So there must be some kind of reason for that. So it makes him basically reevaluate his beliefs, where he's like, "Oh, maybe it does have some kind of sexual connotations, but maybe throwing the guy off a balcony was overkill." Right? So maybe some violence was permitted, but in this case, it was a little extreme. So the point of the Elenchus is not just to annoy people and poke holes in their beliefs. It's actually to find inconsistencies in what you believe. And an important thing to note here is the use of questions. Socrates is always asking questions so that the interlocutor, the person he's talking to, ends up contradicting himself. Socrates never asserts a belief and disagrees with a person outright. This just entrenches people further into their belief. So when you're having an argument or a discussion with someone, if you just flat out disagree with them, it just entrenches them further into that belief, and there's no logical reasoning that goes on. It becomes emotional. Whereas if you use the Socratic method, which is a method of questions and answers, you're questioning the person, and through your questions, you bring up a contradiction in their own beliefs. So they contradict themselves, right? Which means that they have to change one of the beliefs, either the contradiction itself or the thing that they originally claimed. So the point of the Elenchus is not to be an asshole and poke holes in people's beliefs all the time, but it's really to purge ourselves of our own inconsistent beliefs so that what we're left with is a solid foundation of very consistent beliefs, a solid foundation of knowledge and confidence in that knowledge and development of ourself as a person, so that we can fulfill the words that are inscribed on Delphi, know thyself. And that's the great gift Socrates gives us, is the Socratic method, so that we can know ourselves and get closer to the truth and closer to attaining some sort of wisdom.